Okay, so we're going to do our second and final study on the book of Kings. And you'll recall the question that we're really trying to answer, that we boiled it down to, is why in a book about kings is there so much material? A quarter of the book is related or devoted to two prophets, Elijah and Elisha. And what was the purpose of that? I put just a slide to sort of demonstrate or show that. And this is, if you think, these are the chapters of Kings, starting from the top left, going down a column, and then moving over from left to right. And you'll see, just when it's put that way, you see how significant the ministries of Elijah and Elisha are in the book of Kings. And again, it leads to the question, why? Why, when the book is, for the most part, devoted to giving a recounting of the kings of Israel and Judah, why this sort of interruption in this focus on these two prophets? So that's what we're seeking to answer. And to help answer that, we talked about three things that I believe are true about the Hebrew Bible, about the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament, the English Old Testament. And what were those? Do y'all remember? Can you remember what those three things were?
They're ordered differently.
They're ordered and numbered differently, right? So we have 39 books of the Old Testament. They have 22 or 24, and they're ordered a little different. That was one. What else?
They're arranged chiastically.
Okay, often they're structured in a way. Again, we have Frank pointed out, a really big TV last week that I can use to my benefit to help get my meaning across to you. I have font sizes, I have bold, I have underscore, I have strike through, I have italics. I have all these sort of features I can use, and I showed you they didn't even use vowels. They just wanted to get as much text on the page as they could, but they would use literary structures to help convey their meaning, one of which is a chiasm, which is a very important structure they use to sort of indicate what's important in a book, or what the central idea or theme or meaning is. And what was the third? The third was sort of the hardest to explain. Context. What about it, Andre? What about context?
Just the meaning of certain terms and certain things that are going on inside there, and just how to determine what's actually going on in there.
Yep. What's going on, and what was the key point we made about how you might determine what's going on? How you might, context did something. What did it do? It spanned books, right? So even if you had multiple authors, so you remember we had like Zechariah, Malachi, and Haggai, like those are three separate authors writing at three separate times to three different people, but there would be context and even sometimes structure that would span across those books. And so it's important when you think about the scriptures to be able to see that, hey, there may be a storyline, or there may be something that's more than just that one book. And it's right that I think that we study books, especially the epistles like Peter or Revelation. Those were kind of their own context for the most part, but often, especially in these narratives, and remember that was a hard part of narrative. The easy part of narrative is it's a story. Anybody can understand it. The hard part is, what's the point? And that question, often you need to look broader than just the individual book to find the answer. So good job. I'll put these up here again. I do want to give the same disclaimer that I gave last week. First, let me say, these things I think are true. I think they're important in the interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures. But my disclaimer is it's not a requirement, again, to get benefit out of studying the Scriptures. So you can talk about order and number. You can read Chronicles as two separate books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, at the end of the English Old Testament and still benefit from them, right? You don't have to think of them as one book in the middle, at the end of the Hebrew Scriptures in order to get benefit from them. Or structure, right? We've all read the stories of Esther and Jonah and benefited from both those without understanding that they might be structured in a certain way to help convey meaning. Echoes, the idea that context might go across, and I like to use the word echoes, like you're reading later and you think, wow, I feel like I've heard that before. Or they may be referring back to something. You can read the story of Saul without sort of seeing that that's being linked back to Judges 17 to 21 and still benefit from it. But these things are important. Nevertheless, I like to think about Greek and Hebrew. Do we need to read the Bible in Greek and Hebrew in order to get benefit from it? No. Is it good that there are people who read the Bible in Greek and Hebrew and are, sort of have time set aside to do that? Absolutely. Okay, but I just want to continue to give that disclaimer that the Bible is sufficient as is in our English translations for us as a child even to get the wisdom that leads to salvation in Christ Jesus. You don't have to read Greek and Hebrew to get that benefit, and that's the primary benefit, right? Above all benefits, that is without understanding structure or order or any of these things. Okay, so I just want to always give that disclaimer. Now, David did ask last week, still, nevertheless, is there anything you would recommend as we're reading, just to, given that these things are true but not necessary, is there anything you would encourage us as readers, as personal, independent, people who are studying the Bible during the week? And my only suggestion was just to recognize, I think Frank said, I don't remember the exact statistic, but in Revelation, like half of the verses are often, not explicitly, but implicitly sort of referring back to Old Testament things. And so that's true of the whole Bible, that sort of idea. And so the encouragement I think that I would take away from that is read the whole Bible and read it often, because those are things that come because it's like, I feel like I've been there before. I feel like I've heard that before. And so that would be my encouragement, is to read wide and read often, and just keep your radar, sort of on for things like that. Okay, with that disclaimer out of the way, we're going to use these three, are they up there? Yeah, 3 facts to answer the question, why? Why Elijah and Elisha get so much space in the book of Kings. And we're going to go in those orders, and we're going to talk about each of them. We'll go through the first and second probably in about 5 minutes. But don't let that get your hopes up that we'll be done in 15 minutes, because the last one is definitely going to be the longest. But let's start with the order and number of the Hebrew Scriptures. So you'll recall that Kings in the Hebrew Scriptures is in a section called the former prophets. So we have them in our historical section in the English Old Testament. And we think about our historical section in the English Old Testament as Joshua, right? Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, then comes 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. It's kind of in the middle of the story, right? And Chronicles repeats a lot of it, but then it goes on to talk about the time after, where people come back into the land, they rebuild the temple, they rebuild the wall, etc. That's not how it is in the Hebrew Scriptures. In the Hebrew Scriptures, it's in a section called the former prophets. Who thought of Kings as a prophetic work before? Nobody, right? I mean, no English reader thought of it as a prophetic work, but in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's in a section called the prophets. Now, the former prophets and the latter prophets sort of share the same vantage point, and that is around the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the nation. That's sort of their vantage point. One of them looks back and says, why did this happen? We were God's chosen people. Why did we get destroyed? Why did we get exiled? Why are we not living in Jerusalem? That's the former prophets. What happened before? Tell us from a prophetic vantage point why what happened. And then the latter prophets take that same vantage point and they look forward. And they say in the latter days, in fact, in the end of days, it's not going to be like this. It's going to be back to the way it was. Israel's going to be restored to its glory. And so they're both prophetic in that sense. The former prophets, Joshua, Judges, King, Samuel. The latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12. They're both prophetic works, just with sitting from one place, looking 2 different directions. So in that sense, Kings is very much like Isaiah through the 12. And the former prophets are like that. They're prophetic. They're giving God's estimation of that, and they're talking about why things happened the way they did. But in another sense, the way we as English readers often think of Kings is they're much more like Samuel or Joshua or Judges or really Deuteronomy and Numbers and Genesis and Exodus, right? They're telling a story, and they just keep that story going, right? And that's how we've always thought of them. They're more like Chronicles or Ezra or Nehemiah. And that is true. They are very much like the Torah in the fact that they're recounting historical events. And here's where I think it gets really important. Again, often knowing where something is in the Hebrew canon versus English canon is not important. I think it is important here. If you look, it's actually at the end of that, right? So there's a story told from Genesis in the Torah all the way through the former prophets, and it ends there, and things change dramatically. The difference between the former prophets and the latter prophets is very different. It's again, they're both prophetic, but one says, here's what happened all the way to this point, and now from this point something is totally different, and we're looking out into the future. And in fact, as I mentioned before, the historical books, how do we live during this time period? Like, Israel's a chosen nation. We are God's special possession, but it doesn't look like it. How do we live during this time? What does life under the sun look like? How do we explain suffering? How do we explain the providence of God and the fact that the miracles that are recorded in the Torah and in the former prophets, they're not happening anymore? How do we explain that as a people? And that's what those are. So there's a significant change at the book of Kings, a significant end, I would say, to the story of Israel. And again, we would describe it as a dispensational church. We would say there is, something that's happened in the middle of their story, which is the church. But there was a story that was about Israel that came on to Kings, and then something significantly happened at Kings and altered that story. And that's where I think it's really important to see that Kings, at the end of the former prophets, is a significant stopping point where something changes, a transition. I think that's the way it was meant to be read. And I think if you think about Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the English canon or the English ordering, we don't necessarily see that. It's just Kings comes and then, okay, we got the next part of the story, etc. I think in the Hebrew scriptures, there's meant to be this significant change in the book of Kings. And I'm going to bolster that opinion in in a little bit. But for now, that's all I'm going to say, that when you look at its position in the Hebrew canon, it's at the end of that, end of the former prophets, and a big change happens after that. All right, second, and I'll go slow to make sure there's no questions, but second, I want to talk about, and this will be the shortest, I want to talk about the structure of Hebrew books and how they're ordered or structured in a way to convey their meaning. So we talked about Isaiah. And for those who were in the Old Testament survey class, you'll recall that Isaiah is ordered this way because the key point of the story is Hezekiah's response to the Babylonians. That's in Isaiah 36 to 39, and it's highlighted by the author that way so that you can really see that's sort of what the author is driving at. That just like Ahaz, the wicked king, responded by paying off the Assyrians to the crisis that was confronting him, unfortunately so did Hezekiah, the righteous king. He did the same thing. And so that introduces us to this need for a greater king than even Hezekiah, and that's the king that's described, the servant of Isaiah 40 to 66 that's going to come and be greater than Hezekiah. And in one sense, Hezekiah and Ahaz were two totally different people. In another sense, they were the same. They were human, they were frail, they were faulty. We need a different kind of king, and that's what the book of Isaiah teaches. Esther, we talked about. I don't have this up here, but recall the centerpiece of Esther was the king being unable to sleep. And again, the teaching there of how God will providentially watch over Israel during the exile and beyond until they're restored to their glory. Now, when it comes to the book of Kings, it's not surprising. I won't go into detail here. And again, we'll go really quick through it, but it's also arranged in a chiastic manner. And I'm going to just put it up again. First, let me give credit where credit's due. These are not things that I'm coming up with on my own. There's that same book I mentioned before, David Dorsey, that's a really helpful book in this. This is where I've gotten much of this from. But let me just put it all the way up there. I don't have it arranged diagonally, as it were, but I do have sort of this structure of Kings, and you'll see in the middle is the prophet Elisha. So you have sort of the beginning of the Davidic kingdom. So when it comes to that southern kingdom, you've got the start of that with Solomon and all that's going on there, and Rehoboam, and then it sort of shifts, and the focus is on sort of the start of this split and the start of this northern kingdom, and it goes through. It gives some ink to the southern kings, not near as much as Chronicles, but it really focuses on the northern kingdom, and particularly transitions into Ahab. For whatever reason, there's this focus put on Ahab. And then from Ahab comes Elisha, and after Elisha, they review the end of the Ahab dynasty, the end of the northern kingdom, then the end of the southern kingdom. And you can sort of see that going into Elisha and then the unwinding back out afterwards. So let's just say that for whatever reason, I think I'll try to explain what it is ultimately, but for whatever reason, the spotlight is on Elisha in this book. So again, that's what we can learn that the author's trying to convey. For some reason, which we don't know yet, that's actually the question we're answering. Not only is Elisha have a lot of ink, 25% if you throw in Elijah as well, but he's also focused on, the spotlight's on him in this book of Kings for whatever reason. Okay, again, I mentioned we'd get through the first two really fast. but this is where we'll slow down a little bit. So third, this is the one that is hard to explain. Context and therefore meaning will span multiple books often. So what does that mean? Well, let me work my way towards, I guess I explained what it meant. We used the example of the Chronicles of Narnia and how across books you might see themes that repeat, and you might need to understand something about a book here based on something that happened over here. So at a high level we understand, but let me explain how that works in the book of Kings and how that helps us answer the question of why Elijah. First, let me put these two phrases up here and ask, is that meaningful to any of you? And what is it? What are those two?
Beginning and end of stories.
Yeah, of a fairy tale. So you're telling me that, and multiple people are shaking their head and sort of said this, it's like the beginning of a fairy tale and the end of a fairy tale, right? Well, how did you get that from 4 words at the beginning and 3 at the end? You're telling me just seeing that you knew that I was going to talk about the beginning of a fairy tale or the end of a fairy tale?
Yes.
Yeah, right? I mean, that's how it functions. That's just those few words trigger someone who's read any English literature, English fairy tales, to know a fairy tale's coming and a fairy tale's ending, right? I mean, we would agree with that. Now, these words probably don't mean anything to you. They don't mean anything to me either, hardly, right? But let me put the English up there. So in English, it happened after the death of. And if I were to claim that these 3 words, these 3 Hebrew words, marked a significant, I'm going to call it a seam in just a second, but a turning point, a transition from one story to another, you might say, that seems far-fetched. But just a second ago, you told me that you could read those 3 words, those 4 words, and know something new was happening, right? Or something was ending. These words do the same. These are 3 Hebrew words. This phrase is found 4 times in the Old Testament, as is, exactly as is. And it's like those 2 English phrases, only this one I'll say does double duty. It ends a previous, I'm not going to say fairy tale, but let's say story or epic. I like, story seems too short because we have short stories, but it ends like an epic. It ends a large volume of narrative and it starts a new one. It does double duty. Unlike the English where we needed 2 phrases to do that, it does double duty. It ends a long epic and it's going to start a new one. It's found 4 times in the Old Testament, exactly as written. And if you allow for slight variance, there are 6 total significant times where it's doing that, where it's serving as a seam, a transition between 2 epics or 2 stories. Let me put them up there for you. So there are the 4 times that it appears verbatim, with that exactly that same wording, the exact same phrase. There are 2 other times where it's similar. So in Leviticus 16, Yahweh spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron. So after the death of is the same. It doesn't have that very beginning. It happened after the death of. And similarly, Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. Now, oftentimes in this transition between stories, with this phrase, you can see in the verse itself who it's transitioning from to who it's transitioning to in the very verse itself. So let me give you the 4 sort of standard ones. It came about after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, or it came about after the death of Moses that Yahweh spoke to Joshua. It came about after the death of Joshua that God's, sons of Israel inquired of Yahweh. Again, there was no king in those days, no one to transfer the authority to, as it were. It came to death after Saul that David remained 2 days. And so you see there's this transition in the story from one to another. So as we think about the previous slide, this one, and we see that this is in Kings. We see it's at 2 Kings 1:1. And so the question is, whatever we were talking about before, and it was Ahab, whatever we were talking about before, there's some new story that's beginning again in here. And so the question is who? Who does the story transition from? We were talking about the death of Ahab, and now we're going to talk about somebody else. But if we put this up there, who do you think it's going to transition to? Who's going to be the next person our epic is centered around? Elisha, right? It's going to be Elisha. So this is probably not that, again, for those of us who believe that there are markers in literature like happily ever after and once upon a time, this is probably not that surprising. The only thing I want to establish here is when you think about Elisha, you need to think about him in the lines of Abraham, Moses, Joshua, Saul, David. You need to see him as a key figure in the story of Israel. We probably don't, he's probably the least well thought of that way, right? For one, we don't really know what his point is in the story, right? I mean, we're still trying to understand why God included him in the story, unlike Moses or David, where it seems more clear. But we do need to think of him that way. There's these kind of key story changes that include Abraham, Moses, David, Saul, key figures. Well, Elisha is in that as well. Now let me go and add another element to that to make it a little bit more surprising and hopefully a little bit more helpful. So you remember the Chronicles of Narnia example? If I asked you to look on your bookshelf and envision those books, you would look up and say, oh yeah, I see 7 books up there, right? I see 7 stories. I think there's 7 in the Chronicles of Narnia, is that right? Okay, so I'm looking up on my bookshelf, I see 7 of those stories. And if I ask you, okay, well now, what's the equivalent for the Hebrew Bible? Look up on your bookshelf, how many books do you see? And you may say, I see 39, and that would be a great answer. Or I see 24 or 22 if you wanted to use the Hebrew ordering. Or you might go further and you might say, I see 3 sections, you know. I see the Torah, and there's 5 books there, and I see the prophets, and there's 8, and I see the writings, there's 13. And all of those would be great answers. Those would be fine answers. They would be correct. But again, going back to this slide, what I want you to think about is another possible helpful answer is when I think about looking up on the bookshelf to see what books are there, what stories are up there, these markers show that there are 7, I'll say, key stories, with these being the transition points, the seams between the stories, right? There's a story that goes up until the death of Abraham, and there's a story that goes from Abraham to Moses, or I'm skipping because I don't have the Leviticus one here, but there's a story that goes from Joshua up until Saul, etc. There's these stories that are also good ways to think about how the Old Testament, especially that narrative portion before you get to Kings, from Genesis to Kings, how they're envisioned. And maybe that's hard for you to think about. Like, what you're telling me, there's sort of 7 key stories that go across, but how do I look up on the bookshelf and see that? Well, think about it this way. Let's get off the Chronicles of Narnia for a second and think more about the Odyssey. Does anybody remember the Odyssey? I don't mean Adventures in Odyssey. I mean the Odyssey, right? The great work of Greek poetry, which was written by who? Homer, right?
Homer. The
24, the Iliad and the Odyssey, broken into 24 sections, a really large work, one work broken into 24 sections. So now think about the Bible that way. I know you could look up and see the little A authors or the books that are across, but now think of it as one book up on your shelf that has one big A author, the Lord himself, and say within that, like the Odyssey is broken into sections, there's a portion of the big book that's all one work of the Lord, where from Genesis to Kings, there's 7 stories that go across there, or at least 7 stories. There's at least 6 markers here. So there's a story again that is before Abraham and transitions at his death, and from there until the death of the sons of Aaron, and from there until the death of Moses, and from there until the death of Joshua, from there until the death of Saul, from there until the death of Ahab, and then after, there's these 7 sort of stories that go across. And again, that can be harder to visualize because it's not broken up in the way that our books are broken up necessarily. You'll see even like the story ends in the book of Kings. It's, one story goes to the first half of the book of Kings and the next story starts after that. My notes are out of order, I'm sorry. Okay. All right, so the 2 things I think I'd like to say so far about the context is Elisha is important. He's critical. You can see that as he's a key figure in one of these 7 stories. And again, I want you to see that there's these stories that go across from Genesis to Kings that are marked by he lived happily ever after. I mean, actually, it happened after the death of, right? Now, why, again, it seems like, what's the point in all this? This is sort of hard to follow, and what am I gaining from it? This is where I think is what you gain from it, because I'm going to add one more critical component to this. It's going to help us, I think, answer the question, why Elisha? And that is, there's more to it than just, I can break up the narrative from Genesis to Kings into 7 discrete sections like that, or a number of discrete sections. I'm saying there's at least 7. And the argument that I'd like to make is that God has arranged those stories so that they all follow a common pattern. So we've seen the seams between the stories. we're going to show you a very detailed pattern, I think, that continues to repeat throughout those stories that will help us understand what's going on in Kings at the end of the story. But at a high level, when you think about what might be a consistent theme across each, this is going to be a story about a key character in each of these, and God sort of making an arrangement with that key character. What's the word we use when we think about a key or an arrangement God makes with someone? A covenant, right? Right, a covenant. So these are going to be centered around covenants, and Frank has taught us about a number of these covenants in a previous class, but each of these is going to center around a covenant that God makes with his people. So I'm going to start, we're going to go through the very first slide here, and we're going to go, I'm going to, again, trying to show you sort of a pattern through each of these stories. And we're going to go real detailed on the first one, and then the rest I'm just going to show you at a high level as we go through, but I think it's going to inform the question about kings. So let's start here. So we talked about each of these stories being centered around a covenant. So what would be the first covenant?
The Abrahamic covenant.
Before Abraham, though? Noahic, right? So there was a covenant. God destroyed the world. He said, despite the fact that I'm going to destroy the world and I regret making the world, I'm going to show my grace to Noah, and I'm going to start over. And I'm going to give you a promise. And I'm going to make it a promise to you and the world that I'll never do this again. I'll never flood the world by water again that way. And so he makes the Noahic covenant, and he says, be fruitful, multiply, and he says, fill the earth. Go scatter the earth, right? So that's sort of what's happening in that story. Now, what's the problem? Well, how did they fail? If that was what they were told to do. What came next where they failed? Yeah, that's right. Babel failed. What did they do? They didn't scatter. They said, hey, let's make a city. Let's build a name for ourselves. And so despite God having covenanted with the people again, forgiven them of their sins, the people failed again, right? So God, being the gracious God that he is, renews covenant. He's going to renew. He's not going to judge them. He ought to judge the whole world again, right? I mean, they just aren't getting it right. But he's going to take a smaller group of people, and he's going to renew covenant. And Andre already said it. So how did he do that? He found Abraham. He said, I'm gonna do my thing through Abraham. I'm going to make a new covenant. And so he promises this Abrahamic covenant. And you'll notice in each of these covenants that we'll see, when God makes this covenant, he starts it by reminding the people. It's called a historical prologue. It's in all ancient Near Eastern covenants. It's essentially where the authority says, look, here's all the things I've done for you, and why you should follow me in this covenant, why you should enter into this covenant and follow me. And so we have that historical prologue there. And God promises, I will make your descendants, Abraham, like the stars of the sky. I will make them so numerous that you can't count them, right? And oftentimes, when God makes this renewed covenant, there's a theophany. Okay, so theo, does anybody know what the word theos means in Greek? God, right? Theology is the study of God. And phaneo is the Greek word which means to manifest or to be visible. So a theophany is God showing up, right? Is God visible? No, right? He's not visible. We don't see him. But there are times when he comes and he enters into these covenants and he shows up. And it's clear that God has shown up, right? And he did with Abraham. What happened in Abraham? What was the theophany there?
He cut between the animals.
You remember You remember he comes down and Abraham has that vision. So we have this theophany, the smoking oven, the flaming torch. And in the covenant that God's renewing, the grace he's showing, because the world doesn't deserve it, he nevertheless always has a concern. All right, I'm renewing this concern, but God knows people's hearts, and he says, Abraham, I am going to bless you. I'm going to do all these things for you. However, if you don't circumcise your children, or if you disobey, you'll be cut off, right? So there's this concern that comes with it. It's not all honeymoon at that point. God recognizes that even though he's entering into this covenant, there's concern that it's not going to work out in the future. All right, and then there's this period of waiting. So Abraham's been promised numerous descendants, right? So what's the waiting in this case? He's childless, right? He has no children, and he grows what? He grows old. And so Abraham is growing old. He sees no indication that the covenant is going to be fulfilled. And then there's impatience exercised by the covenant person. And what was it in his case?
He got
Sarah got him to lay with her.
To take Hagar, right? Yeah, Abraham took Hagar, right? God had made this promise. Abraham waited for the promise. He grew impatient, as it were. He took Hagar. That was not the right move. And nevertheless, after that, there's the beginning of a fulfillment. And so in this case, what was the beginning of the fulfillment? If Abraham was promised numerous descendants, what would be the... Isaac's born, right? Isaac's born. Okay. All right, so we went through in detail there, and then at the end it says, and at that time Abraham died, and the story's sort of over. The Abrahamic covenant's going to pick up and carry us through. All right, so I'm going to title this From the Noahic Covenant to the Abrahamic Covenant. All right, so fine, that's fine. We went into detail. We could tell that story. We're familiar with it. But the interesting thing is that pattern, I believe, is going to repeat itself. So now let's talk, not quite as much detail and a little bit more quickly, about from the Abrahamic covenant to the next covenant, which is the Mosaic covenant. So I'm actually going to, I told David I was going to put this down, but I can't see it now. So I'm going to move that up there. So there's the promise, Abrahamic covenant. God's going to give them, make them a nation, give them seed. He's going to give a land, right? They're going to have the land. In fact, Abraham's in the land. He's given this land, and God says, I'm going to give you this land. And what do? They take Joseph and they sell him. They send him down to Egypt, right? So they're now in Egypt because of the famine. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole Old Testament, forgive me, but I'm trying to not do too high level. And God's going to renew another covenant with them, despite the fact they sold their own brother into slavery and ended up themselves, as a result, in slavery. Now God is going to make them a nation. He's going to forgive them. He's going to renew his covenant with them. He's going to do it on Mount Sinai. The Mosaic covenant is entered into. You remember Moses says, here's what all God did to you. Let me read one of these historical prologues just so you hear it. I won't do all of these again, but just to hear an example. Exodus 19:4. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you out to myself. So God's just reminding them, as we might do as parents. I know I do. You know what I've done for you? Like, obey me. I've got your best interest in mind. Let me tell you, your mother bore you, whatever I need to say to try to encourage. And again, I'm not attributing that to God, but God's saying, hey, here's what I've done for you, and I'm going to enter into covenant. Now then, if you'll obey my voice and keep my covenant, you'll be my own possession. So there's a historical prologue. There's a promise of Israel being their special possession. And then what does God do? How does he show himself? Remember, they're on the mountain. He comes down on the mountain. Yeah, well, no, not burning bush. So this is when he comes down on the mountain, and there's fire and earthquake, and they got to put a fence around the mountain so nobody goes up on the mountain, because God has shown up. He even shows his glory to Elijah. I'm getting ahead of myself. He shows his glory to Moses, but there's this concern. God's holy. You're not going to be able to worship him. So there's this waiting while this covenant's being made. What are the people down? They're down on the bottom of the mountain, like I just described. They're waiting for Moses to return. They're saying, I don't know if he's coming back. What do we do? God's just said, I'm concerned you're not going to be able to worship me. You don't worship idols. And they go and make an idol. Despite that, the beginning of the fulfillment, this special holy nation begins. How does it begin? It begins because a tabernacle has been built, and because there's a place for God to be among them as their God, and them be the special people. And then you have the death of Aaron's sons. Okay? And from the Mosaic to the Deuteronomic covenant. And people question, how are they the same? How are they different? They seem similar. Why is God renewing another covenant that sounds just like the Mosaic covenant? Deuteronomy, deuteros means second. Nomos means law. It's like second law, second covenant. They had a promise. It was the Mosaic covenant. But then they failed. The Mosaic covenant was, you're going to be a special people. I'm going to take you in. I'm going to plant you in a land, and you're going to be my people. But they wouldn't go. They wouldn't obey God. And especially at Kadesh. They failed throughout, but especially at Kadesh, God says, go, spy out the land. They came back. They said, we're not going in there. There's giants in there. We're not going to go. And so they fail. And God says, nevertheless, I am going to renew my covenant with you a second time. Now let me back up for just a second, because there's a key point that I didn't state in the last two slides that I want to make sure I point out. In each of these covenants, when God renews a covenant with him, with a person, a key person in the story, it's like he does it twice. It's really a lot of critics will say there's something wrong with the Bible. Like the editor of the Bible is having a really hard time, and he's putting a story in twice, and he's duplicating himself or whatever, you know. But like Moses, he got a promise from God twice. You'll remember he had the incident that Andre was talking about where he came between the cut up animals through the smoking, and then later, remember, he's looking out at the stars, and God renews. He says the covenant again to him in that same way. The Mosaic covenant is that way, and you'll see it in the Deuteronomic covenant. So God says, after the people have refused to go into Kadesh, here's what I'm going to do for you. And God makes the promises that he's going to do for them. But then later, he goes through it all again in Deuteronomy, and he lays it out for them again. That's going to become important, that you'll see that 2 times like that. God appears in the tent. He comes. His glory shows up to Moses in the tent. And yet there's this concern that Israel won't obey. They're out in the wilderness waiting for that second generation, because that's essentially what he said in Kadesh. He said, I'm going to take you into the land anyways, but no, only Caleb and Joshua. The rest of you are going to die in the wilderness. That's my promise to you, that I'll take the rest. I'll take your sons in. And so they're waiting for everybody to die off, and Moses grows impatient with the people. He strikes the rock. He's not allowed to go in. But they begin to fulfill it at the end. Before it talks about the death of Moses, you begin to see fulfillment. They've not crossed over to fulfill yet, but they've already started to take some of the land on the east side of the Jordan. And then Moses dies, and we're ready to move on to the next story. All right, now Joshua's covenant. You may say, what is that? I've never heard of Joshua's covenant. Frank didn't teach about that. That's true. But give me a break for just a second. Let me get to it. So there's the Deuteronomic covenant. I'm going to deliver them. You're going to go into the land, but whatever you do, make sure you destroy everything. I don't want a trace of it. I don't want you taking their things. It's called harem in the Hebrew. I want you to destroy completely. A lot of people have a lot of trouble with that. You know, even critics of the Bible or non-believers would say, "Oh, how is it that you serve a God that would command that?" Well, God commanded that, and they didn't do it. They failed. Right? First battle in, because it was in Jericho. It was only second battle in. They realized it. Achan takes some things. He doesn't obey. And sure enough, they failed, and the covenant, their part of the covenant, is already broken. So God says, you know what? Despite you doing that, I'm still going to be faithful to you, and he renews a covenant with them. You remember they stood on 2 mountains, and he said, I want you to read the blessings and the curses, 6 on one mountain, 6 on the other. And even by the end of the book, there's a second sort of renewal, as I mentioned, where Joshua says, look, and you guys all know the verse, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. He said, you choose. And he enters into a covenant for the people that day in Joshua 24. I don't know. I don't think there's a good example, and this is not perfect. I'm sure there are problems with it. I hope people will pick this up once I write about it and put it out on the internet. Somebody will pick it up and make it better. But I don't see a theophany in this case. It's not clear. There is the captain. You remember when they first go over into Jericho? There's the captain of the Lord's host that meets with Joshua. Maybe that's what you would consider the theophany here. Regardless, there is the concern that Israel will be cursed, that they won't be able to obey. As they're waiting for the covenant to continue, they've defeated Jericho, they defeated Ai. I think that's the 2 battles. Then they're waiting for the kings. The kings of the land are like, okay, these cities are not surviving. Let's band together and fight against them. So those opponents are assembling. They're waiting in one of the strongest cities. Remember the Gibeonites? They said, well, we got a better idea. Let's go and tell them we're from a far distance and make a covenant with them. They don't inquire of the Lord like they should, and so they fail in that sense. But nevertheless, the fulfillment that God's promise begins as they begin to take the land. They begin to divide it out, and then Joshua dies. Now, Joshua to Samuel's covenant. Again, you may say, what's Samuel's covenant? I don't remember that one. Just let me explain what I mean by that. Okay, Joshua's covenant is Joshua made a covenant with the people at the end of Joshua 24. They fail miserably to be the Lord's people. They said, hey, we will obey the Lord. Just like you, Joshua, you're committing to be God's, servant. We commit to it as well. They fail. The book of Judges is a great example of that. It's not the best example. The best example is 1 Samuel 8. Where they say, we want a king, we want to be like the other nations. And God says, you're rejecting me from being king over you in 1 Samuel 8:7. So God says to Samuel, remember, hey, it's okay. Don't feel bad. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. I'm still going to bless the people. And so there's a historical recounting there in 1 Samuel 12. I'll just read a couple verses of that again, just to give a flavor, because I think we're doing okay on time. He says, Samuel said to the people, it's Yahweh who appointed Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out from the land of Egypt. Now take your stand, that I may plead with you before Yahweh concerning all the righteous acts of Yahweh which he did for you and your fathers when Jacob went into Egypt. So he's just recounting for them all that God's done through their history as he begins to make this covenant. And there is a theophany in this case, very clearly. It's not one we think about very much, but if you read in 1 Samuel 12, there's this, he says, let me read it because it's not one we're familiar with. Even now take your stand and see this great thing which Yahweh will do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest today? I'll call to Yahweh that he may send thunder and rain. You'll know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of Yahweh by asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel called to Yahweh, and Yahweh sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared Yahweh and Samuel. Then all the people said to Samuel, tell me what echo you hear when you hear this, if you allow me that term. Pray for your servants to Yahweh your God, so that we may not die, for we have added to our sins this evil for asking ourselves for a king. When else was there thunder and rain like that and the people got really afraid? On Sinai, right? Again, you hear that echo, I think, of that. And so there's this theophany where God comes in this marvelous, powerful act and the people fear. But there's this concern. God says, look, you ask for a king, I'm going to give you a king. And if the king will do what I say, everything will be okay. You'll still be my people. I won't. But if you won't listen, I'm going to be against you. So, as you know, Saul is selected as king, and he's asked by Samuel to do what? He says, I'm going to anoint you king, and I want you to do what? Do you remember? I want you to wait 7 days. I know the Philistines are gathering. Wait, I'll come to you. Right? And what does Saul do? He waits. Good for him. He waits, but he doesn't wait long enough. He says, I got to do something. I've got to sacrifice to the Lord. And again, as you read that, I know I did, Samuel's hard to read. It's hard to understand. I mean, the story of Saul is hard to read, even as a narrative. It's hard to understand what's going on. But certainly as I read that, I think, what's the deal there? Like, what's the deal? Why is he upset at him? Why is he telling him to wait and upset that he's not waiting? Well, obviously, as a prophet, he asked him to, so there's that. But it makes more sense when you see there's this sort of, failure for people to wait on the Lord, and they grow impatient and they disobey. And here, that's what Saul does as well. Nevertheless, there is the beginning of a fulfillment, particularly that a righteous king is anointed in the book of Samuel, right? But it's just the beginning of the fulfillment, because what happens after David's anointed? Does he become king immediately? No, long chapters of him running away from Saul, of the sort of long time it takes for him. He does act righteously throughout that time, and then Saul dies. We're getting almost done. I know this is hard. Hopefully, as hard as it is to go through in the what's the word when you do something over and over again? Yeah, but the bad kind of repetition where you for something like if you work in what is it called? Monotony is the word I'm trying to think of. Hopefully the monotony of this is not too bad, and hopefully the repetition is good as you see, hey, I think there may be a pattern here. Samuel to David's covenant. The Davidic covenant we all know about. It's one of the most important ones and very well spelled out. They're working under Samuel's covenant that he made with the people. If you have a righteous king, I'll bless you. But they fail. There's this, they have a righteous king who's been anointed, but he's not reigning. They're picking Ishbosheth. I'm trying to get somebody's attention. Sorry. They're picking Ishbosheth. It's hard to parent while you preach. I apologize. And I lost my train of thought. They've got the northern kingdom not allowing David to be king. So there's this failure of the nation to follow what Samuel has asked, and God says, I'm gonna renew covenant with you. I'm gonna select David, and I'm gonna make him a dynasty. I'm gonna have his son build me a temple. Again, even in the previous one, I didn't call it out. 1 Samuel 10 and 12, there's these two sort of Samuel renewing the covenant 2 times. Even in this, you'll see that it happens with David in 2 Samuel 7, but it's also going to be very clear in 1 Kings 9 that God does this through Samuel as well. There's a theophany where God shows up in the temple. You'll recall, David's not allowed to build it, but once God, through Samuel, builds the temple, through Saul builds the temple, he shows up in the temple, he fills it with his glory. And there's this still concern, David, I won't ever take my favor away from you like I did Saul, but if your sons disobey, I'm going to discipline them with the rod of men, and I'm going to bring discipline, even as David mentioned this morning. David's waiting. He's waiting for the army to return. Maybe this is a stretch. I think I put a question mark there. I do, just to call out myself there. This may be a stretch, but he takes Bathsheba, and that's certainly at least the failure, I think, of David that the author is trying to call out. Nevertheless, despite that failure, there's the beginning of fulfillment, and through the son being born that's loved by the Lord, Solomon. Okay, now we expect maybe a report of the death of so-and-so, and then the next story to start on. We don't have that. We go a long way before if you remember the other ones, Abraham, remember, it recorded his death right after that, or Moses, the sons of Aaron. It was pretty close, but here we have a pretty large gap after the beginning of fulfillment. You've got, in that time period, Absalom's rebellion. You've got Solomon's sin and the dividing of the kingdom. You've got Jeroboam and all that came there. You might wonder, if you notice this pattern and you were a reader, you might wonder, like, what's going on? It's time for God. He's seen enough failure. It's time for him to step in, call out somebody to be the new leader who he covenants with and get us back on track, right? But it takes a little while. And then you eventually get to Ahab and Jezebel. And man, it gets really bad then. And it's only after that we finally read those critical words, once upon a time or happily ever after, to tell us it happened after the death of, that, hey, something new is happening. All right, so again, I'm just going to pause for dramatic effect only to say, that was hard to go through all of those things, but that puts us in a good place to begin to ask the question, what's Elisha doing here? He's a centerpiece in the story, right? He's clearly the one we showed when we pointed at where the chapters were listed out. He's the one that is now introduced. And what do we expect God to do with him? That's a real question. What do we expect? A covenant, a promise. We expect God to make a promise, to make a covenant with Elisha here. All right? So we're working under the Davidic covenant. I'll establish your throne if you obey. If not, I'm gonna punish you ultimately through exile, he said to Solomon. That's what we're working under. There's a failure. We mentioned the kingdom is split. The kings are not obeying, almost all. And then you get to Ahab and Jezebel, and you're asking the question, what is going on? So now it's time, right? It's time for God to renew that covenant with Elisha. So last week, I said, hey, Elijah and Elisha, great stories. What do y'all remember? Silas started by saying, hey, remember on Mount Carmel when the fire came down, and we talked about different stories, but we really didn't talk about a theophany at that. We didn't mention a historical prologue where Isaiah stood up to the people and said, look at all that the Lord did for you. And we didn't remember a covenant, right? Nobody remembers Elisha's covenant being made. He did a number of miracles. He made a widow's oil not run out. He raised the Shunammite son. He purifies a pot of stew. He feeds a multitude with some loaves and has some left over. He cleanses Naaman. He makes an axe head float. And then the story of Kings starts back up. And we start talking about some of the kings, and Elisha dies. And nothing happens. And again, if you've been reading since Genesis and noticing this, you think, what happened just there? I thought you were setting me up. I was ready for Elisha's covenant. Now let me make that sort of feeling even stronger first in two ways. First, think back to Moses, who was the giver of more revelation than just about anybody. We don't know who wrote the former prophets. It may have just been one person. But Moses wrote a lot of revelation. He said something really key in Deuteronomy 18. He said, God's going to raise up a prophet like me, right? And you need to listen to him, right? Do what he says. There's going to be this key figure, right? I mean, they were talking about it in the New Testament times. Even Muslims today, I think, I don't know a lot about Islam, but I think they think that's Muhammad, that, right? And so this is a key scripture about this figure to come, this prophet. You remember they said, is he the prophet? When they were talking about John the Baptist and Jesus, right? I mean, this was a key scripture. Now, what prophet from Genesis to Kings would be like unto Moses? I mean, are there any that, Moses was the Bible says, right? He was humble, but he talked face to face to God. He did miracles in front of Pharaoh. He brought down plagues from God among the most powerful nation in the world. I mean, it's hard to be somebody like unto Moses. So I don't want you to, don't go easy. There were prophets and prophetesses all along those lines. Were there any that were like unto Moses? Now, if you saw, I don't think so. I can't think of anybody that would maybe fit that category. But when you start to see Elisha doing what he's doing, is he, or Elijah for that matter, right? Elijah's calling down fire from heaven. I think we're getting into that territory, don't you? So already in the back of our mind, forget all these 7 stories with their common details. Already in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I remember what Moses said. Is this the prophet? And again, he does all those miracles, but nothing. They die, and he dies, and the story goes on. Let me make it even more difficult in a second way, once I get my notes in order. This is a good segue. We've been talking about Elisha mostly, but I want us to talk about Elijah for a second, right? Again, Elijah was a magnificent and amazing prophet. And we, again, talked about the stories of Elijah. I mentioned what Silas mentioned. It was an amazing display of God's power, the fire coming down. But what happens after that? And I mentioned it last week. I actually want everybody to turn to 1 Kings 19. So we're going to read a significant amount of this. But what happened? So he calls down fire. He goes and prays. The rain comes. He chases, or the chariot goes back to Samaria. Ahab in the chariot goes back to Samaria. Elijah runs back. Ahab tells Jezebel what Elijah did, namely he killed all those prophets. And what does Jezebel say?
He's a dead man.
You're a dead man. Yeah, you're a dead man, Elijah. And what does Elijah do? He runs. He runs from there was the northern kingdom up in Samaria. He runs all the way down through the southern kingdom to the bottom of the southern kingdom and into the wilderness. And that's where we're going to pick up in verse 6 of chapter 19. So Isaiah's laying down, verse 5. He's sleeping because, he's gone a long way. And he's just been through a lot of drama, in the good sense of the word. Just an amazing event that's just happened. And now his life's under threat. It's just a lot of stress, I guess you could say. Regardless, he's down, he's sleeping. And then verse 6, he looks, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Now, it's going to feel like a stretch at first, but hopefully it won't after I continue through the story. But he's in the wilderness and he's being fed supernaturally with bread and water. Now again, it may feel like a stretch, but what does that make you think of?
Exodus.
Yeah, it makes you think of Exodus, right? It makes you think of God providing for the people as they leave Egypt after a miraculous display of God's power, right? He's 10 plagues, he's got them out. Through the wilderness, they need bread and water. They're headed to where? They're headed but before the promised land. Where did God say?
Sinai.
He's headed to Sinai. We don't know yet where Elijah's headed, but those of us who've read the story know he's headed to Sinai, and God's sustaining him with bread and water in the wilderness. Okay? Keep reading down. Angel of Yahweh comes to him a second time and says, "Get up. The journey's too great for you." So Elijah gets up, he eats and drinks, and he goes in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, who else has gone in the strength of food 40 days and 40 nights? Jesus, but who else?
Moses.
At this time. Not Noah.
Moses.
Moses, right? And Moses in particular was on the mountain of Horeb 40 days and 40 nights without food and water. So maybe it's a stretch, but if you ask me, the author of Kings wants me to think about Moses, wants me to think about what happened on Mount Sinai. And it gets worse, in a good sense. Then he came there to a cave and lodged there. Okay, well, skip just for a second to verse 11. And behold, Yahweh was passing by. Now, who has been in a portion of the mountain when God passes by? Moses, right? Again, so maybe it's feeling less like a stretch to you. Okay, now why did Moses go up to Horeb? Now, God said at the burning bush, "You'll worship me on this mountain when I deliver you." But why did he go up? Why did God call him up to Horeb?
Receive the law.
To receive the law. And particularly, the law was a part of what? The covenant, right? So he covenanted with the people up on Mount Sinai. That's what the people got tired of waiting for. Moses was up there 40 days and 40 nights. He was getting the law from God, right? Now, God says to Elijah in verse 9, "Hey, what are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, again, if we had to just guess what Elijah's doing there. Now, a lot of people will say Elijah was depressed, and I'm sure he's been through a lot. But if we had to guess, what is he doing there?
Get a promise or a no?
Yeah, it feels to me like this is, he even mentions his fathers in verse 4. It's enough now, Yahweh, take my life. I'm not better than my fathers. He's thinking about what's happened before him. And this is where Moses received the covenant from God. And again, it's been a while. It's been a while. The Davidic covenant has been in place. Solomon and the glory of Israel. The Solomonic era is a great representation of what the millennial kingdom is going to be like. I mean, it's not going to be as good. It's going to be better. But that's what God intended it to look like. He was at peace with all his enemies. It was riches. It was wisdom and ruling. And from there, it just slid down to Jezebel all the way. I mean, it was just in generations of it. And Elijah comes on the scene and is just like, it's just me. What's the deal, God? I'm coming here, I guess, as one last ditch effort. They didn't listen to me before. Jezebel did not repent. We didn't get, the kingdom brought in. I'm coming because God, I'm the next one, right? Or renew a covenant with us, That would be my guess. But God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he says, I've been very zealous for Yahweh. Sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars and killed your prophets. I alone am left. So let's renew the covenant with me, God. Verse 11, what happens? What do we expect? It's up here on the screen. What do we expect when the covenant's renewed?
Theophany.
A theophany, right? What happens in verse 11? He stands on the mountain, and there's this massive wind and fire and an earthquake, right? Hey, it's happening, right? Is it? No, the Lord's not in them. He's not in the wind. Again, what does that mean? Who knows? I mean, it's just a great scene in Fiddler on the Roof, right? That's all it is, right? I mean, what does all this mean? Who knows? But it's God saying, or the author, it's one and the same. I guess I don't have to pick between the two. It's God saying, okay, that's what you would expect here if I were going to renew the covenant with you, right? Verse 12, though, comes. The Lord's not in any of those. And in the end, all he hears is nothing. It says, I know, a gentle blowing, or in your version it may say a small whisper. That word is used 2 other times. In Psalm 107, he made the storm be still. In Job 4, a form was before it stood still, I couldn't discern its appearance. A form was in front of my eyes. There was silence, then I heard a voice. So ultimately, whatever the Hebrew means there, it's quiet. So there's been all this amazing theophany, all this, but God's not in it, and then there's just nothing. Just nothing. And what happens? Elijah wraps his face. Moses covered his face right after receiving the law. Elijah wraps his face, goes out, stands at the entrance of the cave, and God says, behold, I make a covenant with you. He says, Elijah, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And ultimately, he says the same answer in verse 14, and God says, Elijah, you're going to die. Your ministry's over. I want you to go and anoint these people. The story's going to go on. Here's going to be the king of Israel. Here's going to be the king of Aram, and Elisha is going to be in your place. No covenant. Elijah's sent home, and nothing happens. Now, there's hope, though. There's hope, because keep reading. In verse 16, he's going to anoint Elisha as prophet in his place, right? He's going to anoint him. Have you heard of a prophet being anointed before? That's the first I've heard of that. But who else has been anointed in this story?
Kings.
Yeah, kings. And what king in particular?
David.
David, right? There's an anointing that's going to go take place. So maybe Elijah's just not the one, right? It's Elisha. We're going to anoint him. And where does he find Elisha in verse 19? He's plowing. Does that ring any bells?
David was out keeping the sheep.
That's one, but even more close. Who else was out plowing? Saul. That's right. Saul was plowing. What did Saul do? He was told, hey, I think it's Jabesh Gilead, they're going to cut their eye. What is it? They're going to pluck one of their eyes out, and it was weird. It's a weird story. He says, hey, I'll give you a day to see if anybody will help you. I don't know what kings do that, but they find Saul. He's out plowing. What does he do? Isaiah.
Cuts up the oxen.
He cuts up the oxen, right? And sends it up and says, hey, we need to gather. We need to marshal the forces. And Elisha, here he is. He's out plowing. They find him. He gets rid of the oxen. They sacrifice them, and he's next. So again, even though Elijah was rejected in a sense, it feels like, Elisha is going to be our man, right? So that's what we expect. But as I mentioned already, there is none. Elisha does those miracles. He comes off the scene, he dies, and then we have 2 Kings 17 and 25, which is the destruction of the northern kingdom by Assyria and the destruction of the southern kingdom by Babylon. And if you read in the latter prophets, and even in the former, this is an example, Hosea. God said in Hosea 1, I'm not going to have compassion anymore. I'm done. You're not going to be my people anymore. I'm done having compassion on you. And so that's, when you think about that phraseology, having compassion, that's what God did in each of those stories. They failed every time. And God said, you know what? I ought to blot you out, but I'm going to have compassion and I'm going to renew my covenant with you. And God says here, I'm not. I'm done having compassion. So as a reader, you expect it, right? I mean, surely God's going to do it again, but nope, I'm done. And he doesn't. And he destroys the nation. And the story ends, as I mentioned. That's the end of the former prophets. That's the end of that section of the Hebrew Scriptures. And up comes the latter prophets. And their message is, actually, even though God said that, even though he said, I'm done having compassion, and he did, he showed it, I'll have it one more time. I'm going to have compassion one more time. And what is he going to do? What do the latter prophets say he's going to do? He's going to make a new covenant. That's right. So I'm going to make one more covenant with you. And the latter prophets talk about, and we mentioned this in passing last week, they talk about who it's going to be made with. That's the book of Isaiah. They talk about what it's going to be like, the new covenant. That's Jeremiah. They talk about where it's going to happen in the land, Ezekiel. They talk about when it's going to happen. And that's the 12. So that's the story. And that's why Elisha is in the story. He's in the story because he's a foil, as it were. I think foil is the right term, where it's a contrast to what God is going to do. But by his absence and by him not renewing covenant with Elijah or Elisha, and then the latter prophets picking up and saying, it is going to happen in the future. But we're done for now. The story is over. And there'll be a time in the latter days when the story finishes up and God makes a new covenant. Now, before we end, I just want to say, I think there may be a little bit more. This is hard. Narrative's hard. Again, I feel like when you are teaching narrative, it can be hard because you kind of go out on a limb because it's not explicit. You remember the slide we did last week where John says, I'm writing that you may have joy, or Proverbs that you may have wit. Like, it's not explicit. So it's hard. But I want to go out on a limb, even though I'm going to call it a limb so that you know it's a limb. But I think there's maybe a little bit more that we can learn as well in addition. And especially when you allow the New Testament to come in, it's much better when the New Testament comes in and explains it fully, and it's explicit about it. But it's not. So take that, and again, take all of this. This is hard, and I'm sure things on these slides are wrong. I'm positive, but I do think at a high level, let's call it 80%. I think it's what the authors are intending us to understand. But when you think about Elijah and Elisha and the why of them being in Kings, I think there's a little bit more we can say, and that is, again, the expectation was very, in my mind at least, very clear that Elijah and then Elisha were the ones that were going to be who God renewed a covenant with. He was going to be the prophet. And you see the New Testament pick up this language. You see the Old Testament pick up this language. Malachi ends, again, the 12 are answering the question, when it's going to be. Malachi says, I'll send Elijah before that day, right? So why does he pick Elijah?
Because that's when it.
That's what we expected, right? And so we can use Elijah to mean the person before Elisha, and we can use Elisha to mean the person God's going to renew covenant with, right? Maybe. I mean, again, this is not explicit in the New Testament, but when you ask, why Elijah? Why is John the Baptist compared to Elijah as an example? He's a forerunner. What are you? Are you Elijah? And if you care to accept it, John the Baptist himself is Elijah. What do they mean by that phraseology? They mean the person I'm making covenant with is coming after John the Baptist. And after the Elijah, and John the Baptist is Elijah. So the person he heralds is the person I'm making covenant with, right? Which is Jesus, who he made the final covenant with, which is who Isaiah said would be the one. Now, Elisha too, though, and this is what's amazing to me. Again, Elisha is I want us to think of him as a key figure in Scripture, but I think he's probably one of the least thought of if you compare him to Moses and David. But it's interesting for me to think about the miracles that Elisha did and compare that to what the Lord did. So Elisha follows Elijah to his death, and what does he want? He wants a double portion of the spirit of Elijah's spirit, the spirit that Elijah has. He doesn't mean Elijah's spirit, but the spirit that Elijah has, which is the Holy Spirit. That's how Elijah's able to do these miracles, right? He wants a double portion. Well, John says Jesus has the spirit, but he doesn't have a double portion or triple. He's got it without measure, right? So I mentioned to you before, Elisha fascinatingly feeds 100 people with 20 loaves and has some left over. Isn't it amazing that Jesus comes on the scene and does 5,000 and 4,000 with 2 loaves, or I don't know, that's 2 fish, however many loaves it were. 5, thank you. Elisha raises the dead. That's what Jesus does. Elisha heals from leprosy. That's what Jesus does. Elisha, the story of his is after his death. In fact, he's in the grave, right? And they're opening up his grave. They're going to bury somebody else. Some marauding bands come. I don't know if you remember this story. And they're like, and they throw the body into the grave. And the guy comes back to life when he touches the bones of Elisha, right? So he has this sort of power about him that even just touching him can heal. And you remember the lady that's got the discharge of blood, same thing. Elisha knows the secrets of others. They're worried who's the mole in the Aramean army, who's telling the Israelites their plans. Well, it's not. It's just Elisha. He knows. He knows what the king is saying in his bedroom. Jesus knows what others are thinking. Someone whose miracles are done outside of his hometown. Jesus compares himself to Elisha when they are demanding of him miracles in his hometown. Elisha, I think Elsie came up with this, reminded us this story about the bears, right? I mean, that's an odd story too. Elisha gets mocked. He's got a wrathful side, doesn't he? And Jesus does too. He has a wrathful side, as we saw in Revelation. And those who will mock and not follow him, he will repay with wrath. Someone who nevertheless, despite that, shows love to enemies. And you remember that same story when they are blinded, the Aramean army, when they come down, they come because somebody in the Aramean army's in that general's council says, hey, it's Elisha. So, well, I'm going to go get Elisha. They go to get Elisha, and remember, they're really scared. In fact, there's a story I'll tell in just a second. They're really scared, and the servant Elisha is really scared, and Elisha says, don't worry. And he says, open his eyes, Lord. And he looks up, and he sees all the host of heaven. And ultimately, they blind the Aramean army. They march them into Samaria, and the king of Samaria says, what do? Do we kill him? And what does Elisha say? He says, feed him and send him home, right? So, again, this idea of showing love to his enemies even obviously shows up in Jesus's teaching. I think the next one's a stretch, and for time's sake, I won't even say it. But and then another stretch would again, that story I just mentioned, where Elisha is opening the eyes of the servant. God is opening the eyes of the servant through Elisha's prayer to see the heavenly host. And I just think of Jesus when he, I always wanted somebody to make a picture of Jesus, on the cross, or maybe better in the Garden of Gethsemane, where you see the host of heaven, just like being held back. You think about people being held back in a fight, like don't get in there, I'm sure they want to go and rescue him, just like Jesus said they could at his command, but he doesn't. And Jesus is not afraid, and he knows he's got the host of heaven against anything that he needs. But anyways, maybe a stretch, but one that I enjoy. So that's it. In conclusion, I think Elisha is in the book because there's an expectation as you read the narrative that God is going to renew covenant, because he's so compassionate. He's always been. And Elisha's there to get that expectation as the reader, to show, hey, here's the guy. And then God doesn't. He doesn't. He doesn't have compassion on them. But the reason he does it, he's a good God. The reason he does it is because he's going to deal with more than just Israel. And so this is going to be his plan for bringing in more than just Israel. And through his son, he's going to bring the nations in. And hopefully, in addition to him being a foil, we see that he's also, I don't want to use the word type, that may be too strong, but he is one that Jesus modeled. He's one that Jesus did many of the same things. And again, as a New Testament Jewish leader, you should see this. And I can see Jesus rebuking Nicodemus and saying, you should see this. You should see this is the story. This was the plan. I'm the one who fits this. I'm the one God's going to make the covenant with. And he does through his death. So that's it. We'll pray and we will be dismissed. God, we thank you for that plan. We thank you for, though we were all separate from you, we were distant from your promises. The New Testament says we were strangers to your covenant. We weren't a part of any of those other than the Noahic, I guess. We were not a seed of Abraham. We were not in the Davidic line. We were not a part of the people of Israel. We were strangers, and you brought us near. You, through your Son and his sacrifice, made him an offering that would bring many peoples to you, including us, Father. And we thank you for that. We also see that that Jesus will return, and he will offer that second time to Israel. Israel will accept him. Israel will be saved. He brought the covenant, but there is that two aspects of it, and there will be another time when Jesus comes. He brings Israel in, and he restores the kingdom, and all the promises of those other covenants that always led to failure. And even though we would see the promise begin to be fulfilled, they always led to failure. That won't be the case in the millennial kingdom. You'll come, you'll restore the kingdom, and it will be good for 1,000 years. And we thank you for that. And we thank you that because of your plan, we get to be a part of that. Lord, we ask that you help us to love you with all of our heart, and help us to love each other the way that we would want to be loved. In Jesus' name, amen.